There is a moment, right before a race, when every single competitor believes they have already won. And then one car rolls up to the starting line that nobody saw coming. A car built not to look fast, but to actually be faster than physics itself seemed to allow. And in an instant, every single one of those confident competitors realizes they have already lost. That is the story we are telling today. 5 fastbacks that history somehow forgot. 5 machines that in their own moment on this earth outran everything else on 4 wheels. And yet today, barely get mentioned when people talk about the golden age of American muscle. If you already think you know this era, I promise you, stick around. Because by the end of this list, you're going to hear about a car that literally could not be raced anymore because it was too fast, banned outright. And another that was so radical the men who designed it were terrified their own bosses would say no. This is the story of speed, obsession, and 5 forgotten shapes that changed automotive history forever. Let's get into it. Number 5. The 1966 Plymouth Barracuda Formula S. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Everybody assumes the Ford Mustang invented the whole pony car fastback craze. It did not. Plymouth beat Ford to the punch by literally 16 days. 16 days before the Mustang ever rolled into a single dealership showroom. Plymouth had already put the Barracuda on sale, and it already had that sweeping, glassed, and fastback rear end that would go on to define an entire era of American performance cars. Think about that for a second. The car everyone credits as the trendsetter was actually chasing a trend that Plymouth had already set. So why does almost nobody remember it that way? Because in 1964, Plymouth made a decision that would haunt the Barracuda for its entire existence, rather than building it as its own distinct model with its own identity. The way Ford would soon do with the Mustang, Plymouth built the Barracuda on the humble, thoroughly unglamorous Valiant platform. And worse, they barely bothered to disguise that fact. The front end, the doors, practically the entire car forward of the windshield was straight up Valiant, a car associated with grandmothers and economy commuting, not performance and swagger. Buyers noticed immediately, and the automotive press noticed even faster. While the Mustang launched with an entire dedicated marketing blitz, a distinct sheet metal identity, from bumper to bumper, and a name that instantly meant something new and exciting, the Barracuda launched looking, to the average customer walking through a Chrysler Plymouth showroom, like Plymouth had simply bolted an enormous rear window onto a car they already had sitting around. It is one of the most brutal ironies in automotive history. The company that got there first ended up looking like the copycat, purely because of how it chose to present its own innovation. But Plymouth was not about to give up that easily. By 1965, and then more seriously into 1966, with the introduction of the Formula S performance package, Plymouth started fighting back hard. The Formula S added a genuinely stiffened suspension, wider tires that actually gripped the road with authority, and a torquey 273 cubic inch V8 that gave the Barracuda real bite to go along with that sweeping fastback silhouette. Road testers who actually got behind the wheel came away impressed. Some even calling it a genuinely better handling car than the Mustang of the same era, a claim that would have shocked anyone who only ever glanced at the 2 cars sitting side by side in a parking lot. And here is the detail that collectors obsess over today. That massive wraparound fastback rear window on the Barracuda was, at the time it debuted, the largest piece of curved automotive glass ever installed on a production car anywhere in the world. It was an engineering flex disguised as a styling feature, a genuine industry first buried inside a car that history simply chose to forget. The Barracuda would eventually reinvent itself entirely in 1970, ditching that Valiant-based body for the drop-dead gorgeous E-body shape that gave us the legendary Hemi-Cuda. But that first fastback generation, the one that actually got there before the Mustang and quietly pioneered pony car performance, rarely gets its due. It was first, it was fast, and it was almost completely forgotten. But here is where things start to get genuinely wild. Because the next car on this list was not just fast, it was engineered by a small, obsessive team who were essentially told no by their own company and built it anyway. Stick with me. Number 4. The 1968 AMC AMX. If you have been following this channel, you already know American motors love to punch above its weight, and nothing proves that quite like the AMX. Picture the situation AMC found itself in during the late 1960s. Every single major competitor, Chevrolet with the Corvette, Ford with the Mustang and Shelby lineup, Dodge and Plymouth with their expanding muscle car armies, all had a genuine flagship halo car, something that generated headlines and dragged customers into showrooms purely on excitement and bragging rights. AMC had nothing like that. So a small, fiercely dedicated engineering and design team inside AMC decided to build one themselves, and they decided to build something almost nobody expected from a company known mostly for sensible, budget-conscious family cars. They took the Javelin platform, chopped a full 12 inches out of the wheelbase, and created America's only genuine two-seat production fastback sports car, built entirely from scratch, since the original Ford Thunderbird more than a decade earlier. Think about the audacity of that move. A struggling underdog automaker, competing against companies with vastly deeper pockets, decided the answer was to build the single most uncompromising, purest sports car layout in the entire American market. A razor-sharp fastback roofline with room for exactly two people and nothing else. No back seat, no pretense of practicality, just pure aggressive intent from the windshield to the tail, and it did not just look the part. AMC dropped their largest available engine, a 390 cubic inch V8 producing a genuinely serious 315 horsepower, into a car that weighed dramatically less than most of its muscle car rivals, thanks to that shortened wheelbase and tight two-seat packaging. The result was a power-to-weight ratio that shocked people who assumed AMC could only build economy cars. And then AMC did something that still gets talked about in automotive circles today. To prove they were serious, they took a modified AMX out to the Goodyear Proving Grounds in Texas and set 106 separate speed and endurance records in a single day, with legendary racing driver Craig Breedlove behind the wheel. 106 records obliterated in 24 hours by a company nobody expected to even be competing in that conversation. For one brief, brilliant moment, the underdog had genuinely embarrassed the giants. So why has the AMX faded from popular memory the way the Mustang or the Camaro never has? Simple, brutal math. Total production across its entire three-year run from 1968 to 1970 came in under 20,000 units combined. A rounding error, compared to the hundreds of thousands of Mustangs Ford was cranking out in the very same years. Rarity made it a footnote instead of a legend, even though by every objective performance measurement that mattered in 1968, it deserved to be mentioned in the exact same breath as anything coming out of Detroit, Dearborn, or Los Angeles. Now, if you thought that story was about pure defiance, wait until you hear what happens next. Because the next two cars on this list were not built to win races. They were built because their engineers had discovered something that terrified their own competition, a shape so aerodynamically extreme, it was actually rewriting the outer limits of how fast a stock car could physically go. Number 3. The 1969 Ford Torino Talladega. We touched briefly on Ford's aerodynamic ambitions in an earlier video, but the full story of the Talladega deserves its own spotlight, because this is where the fastback wars stopped being about showroom styling entirely and became a genuine all-out arms race for speed itself. By late 1968, Ford's engineers had run into a hard ceiling. Their standard Torino Cobra sports roof, gorgeous as it was hitting an aerodynamic wall at the highest NASCAR speeds, generating drag that was quietly costing them races against increasingly aggressive competition from Dodge and Plymouth. So Ford's engineering team did something almost nobody outside the sport ever fully appreciated. They extended the entire front end of the Torino by a startling 5 inches, reshaped and smoothed the nose into a dramatically lower, flatter, more slippery profile, and even went so far as to tuck the front bumper further under the car to cut turbulence at speeds most street cars of the era would never dream of approaching. They named this reworked homologation special the Talladega, after the brand new, terrifyingly high-banked Alabama Superspeedway that had just opened. A track specifically engineered for sustained speeds that made every previous NASCAR circuit look tame by comparison. The results were almost immediate and completely dominant. Torino Talladegas, along with their Mercury Cyclone spoiler, two siblings we discussed previously, won an astonishing 30 races during the 1969 NASCAR season, an absolutely commanding performance that effectively buried the competition for that entire year. Richard Petty himself, arguably the single most famous stock car racer in American history, famously jumped ship from Plymouth to drive a Ford, specifically because the Talladega's aerodynamic advantage was simply that undeniable, that game-changing. Let that sink in for a moment. The single biggest star in the sport switched manufacturers chasing this exact shape. But here's the twist that explains why almost nobody remembers the Talladega's name today. Ford built it purely, exclusively to satisfy NASCAR's homologation rule, the requirement that a minimum number of any race car had to actually be sold to regular customers. They built just enough Talladegas, a mere handful over 700 units, to legally qualify and did essentially zero marketing or promotion around the street versions. There was no flashy advertising campaign, no magazine cover shoots, nothing. The vast majority of everyday buyers walking into Ford dealerships in 1969 never even knew the Talladega existed as a purchasable option. It was a pure engineering weapon, built to win on Sunday, sold almost silently on Monday, and it quietly changed the entire trajectory of NASCAR aerodynamics forever, all while remaining one of the most obscure entries in Ford's own performance history. And if the Talladega sounds extreme, brace yourself, because what Dodge did next made it look almost conservative by comparison. This next car did not just chase an aerodynamic advantage, it chased an actual specific number that had never before been reached by a production-based stock car, and the story behind achieving it is genuinely one of the wildest in racing history. Number 2, the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona. Dodge watched Ford's Talladega dominate the early part of the 1969 season, and they were not about to sit back and accept it. Dodge's engineers, working under intense pressure and an absurdly tight deadline, decided that a slightly extended nose was not going to cut it this time. They needed something far more radical. And what they built genuinely looks like nothing else that has ever rolled off an American assembly line before or since. The Charger Daytona received a massive pointed nose cone extending 18 full inches beyond the standard Charger's front end, a shape so aggressive and unusual that it looked more like something from an aircraft hangar than a Dodge dealership. And then, towering above the rear deck, Dodge bolted on a wing so enormous, so bizarrely tall, that it stood higher than the roofline of the car itself. Engineers had discovered through painstaking wind tunnel testing that the wing needed to sit up in cleaner, less turbulent air well above the car's own wake to generate meaningful downforce, and they simply refused to compromise the design for the sake of looking conventional. The result looked genuinely alien, sitting in a 1969 dealership parking lot, next to ordinary sedans and family wagons, and plenty of regular customers thought it looked downright ridiculous. But on the high banks of a NASCAR superspeedway, that ridiculous-looking shape became an absolute weapon. On March 24, 1970, driver Buddy Baker took a Charger Daytona out onto the banking at Talladega Superspeedway and became the first person in history to lap a closed-course stock car at over 200 miles per hour. Let that number sit with you for a second, especially once you remember this was, underneath all that radical bodywork, still fundamentally a production-based Dodge Charger, the same basic platform ordinary customers could special order from their local dealer. 200 miles an hour, achieved by a car built on a chassis shared with family sedans. It genuinely terrified NASCAR's governing body. The sanctioning organization was so alarmed by the sheer speeds these winged cars were now capable of reaching that they moved almost immediately to change the rules specifically to neutralize them, eventually mandating such severe engine displacement restrictions on any car using this aerodynamic package that it became functionally impossible to compete with one. The Charger Daytona's reign at the absolute pinnacle of stock car speed lasted barely more than a single season before regulators legislated it out of relevance entirely. It did not lose on the track. It got banned by its own success. And that success and that ban is precisely what sets up the final, most extreme car on this entire list. Because if the Daytona forced NASCAR's hand, the very last car we are covering today is the one that finally broke it completely. The car so fast, so radical, and so effective that it triggered rule changes severe enough to end this entire era of racing outright. If you have made it this far, do not go anywhere because this final entry is the wildest story of them all. Number 1, the 1970 Plymouth Superbird. Everything that came before this final entry on our list. The Barracuda's forgotten head start. The AMX's defiant record run. The Talladega's silent engineering triumph. The Daytona's terrifying 200-mile-an-hour lap. All of it was essentially the build-up to this single car. Plymouth watched Dodge's Charger Daytona absolutely dominate the tail end of the 1969 season and immediately understood they needed their own version of that same winged aerodynamic weapon, built around their own Roadrunner platform, and they needed it ready to race almost instantly. What Plymouth's engineers produced was, if anything, even more extreme than the Daytona that inspired it. The Superbird's nose cone stretched even further forward than the Charger's. Its rear wing sat even taller and more dramatically upright, and the entire package was refined based on everything Dodge's engineers had already learned from the Daytona's real-world racing results. This was not a first attempt. This was a second, sharpened, more ruthlessly optimized swing at exactly the same problem. And the racing results proved it beyond any argument. Richard Petty, the very same driver who had jumped to Ford specifically to chase the Talladega's advantage the previous year, jumped right back to Plymouth for 1970, specifically and exclusively to drive the Superbird, and he proceeded to win 8 races that season behind its wheel alone. NASCAR's homologation rules at the time required manufacturers to build one street legal example for roughly every 2 dealerships in their entire national network, which meant Plymouth had to produce nearly 2,000 road-going Superbirds just to keep their race cars legal, an enormous, expensive commitment purely to satisfy a rulebook. And here is the part of this story that genuinely still stuns people today. The twist that makes this car so perfectly, tragically forgotten. Those 1970 street Superbirds, with their towering wings and comically long pointed noses, were, at the time, considered so bizarre-looking, so aggressively strange, sitting in a suburban driveway next to ordinary family cars, that dealers across the country genuinely struggled to sell them. Cars sat on lots for months. Some dealers reportedly resorted to converting unsold Superbirds back into standard wingless roadrunners just to move inventory off their showroom floors, physically removing the very aerodynamic hardware that had just made automotive history on national television, purely because customers thought it looked too weird to drive to the grocery store. Think about the sheer irony sitting inside that fact. The single most aerodynamically dominant, genuinely history-making fastback of the entire muscle car era, a car that directly led NASCAR to ban an entire category of racing, specifically because it was too fast to safely compete against, could not even convince ordinary customers to drive it home from the dealership. NASCAR's response to the Daytona and Superbird's overwhelming dominance was swift and absolute. Starting with the 1971 season, the sanctioning body restricted any car running this winged aerodynamic package to a mere 305 cubic inches of engine displacement, an almost comically small figure compared to the massive engines these cars had been running. A number so restrictive, it effectively legislated the entire winged car era out of existence in a single stroke. The Superbird and Daytona had not been beaten on the racetrack by a faster car. They had been beaten by their own rulebook, forced into retirement because the sport's governing body could not figure out any other way to slow them down. Today, of course, that same commercial failure has become an almost unbelievable collector's item success story. Original, unmolested Superbirds regularly sell at major auctions for well over $150,000, occasionally climbing dramatically higher for exceptionally documented, numbers-matching examples. Cars that dealers once could not give away now represent some of the single most valuable and sought-after muscle cars in the entire hobby, a complete, almost poetic reversal of Fortune 5 full decades in the making. So there you have it. 5 forgotten fastbacks that, in their own specific moment in automotive history, genuinely outran absolutely everything else on 4 wheels, and yet today rarely get mentioned in the same breath as the more famous names that get all the attention. A Barracuda that beat the Mustang to market and still got remembered as the copy. An AMX that set over 100 speed records in a single day and still remains one of the most overlooked muscle cars ever built. A Talladega that quietly dominated an entire NASCAR season while barely anyone outside the sport ever knew it existed. A Daytona that hit 200 miles an hour and got banned for its trouble. And a Superbird so far ahead of its time that dealers could not even give it away, only to become one of the most valuable collector cars on the entire planet decades later. If this deep dive into automotive history that time nearly erased kept you hooked until this very last sentence, do us a huge favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because we have got plenty more forgotten legends like these 5 coming your way very soon. And before you go, we genuinely want to know down in the comments, out of these 5 overlooked machines, which one do you think deserved to be a household name, and which one would you most want parked in your own garage today? Let us know, and we will catch you in the next video.